Yes.
Yeah. So it's all looking a bit exciting, isn't it? Well, not this morning. Not looking at that ECMWF. It seems to have gone away. I can't help thinking there's going to be some sort of snow event next week, potentially middle end of next weekend somewhere. But
I think the models will wobble a bit while they understand the extent of the cold air, but they're still sort of, even with the wobbles, they still sort of default back into a sort of northeasterly. So they sort of have a think about it, and then they just fall back into a cold pattern. It does. I mean, it has the hallmarks of the 2010 routine. If you imagine the very beginnings of that, where let's say about the 20th of November 2010, we started to get a bit of a northerly. And I remember it that we kept thinking, oh, well, parts of Scotland are getting snow. North Yorkshire moors and Scarborough and places like that are getting snow. Then there was some snow in Wales, and it was like, oh, it's all missing everywhere else around here, and there's nothing coming into the Midlands or anything like that. And it was just cold, and it was a bit like this in the last week of November. But that was the initial northerly push. But then from that, eventually, by the very end of the month, came the more potent east-northeasterly, and that is then what brought the eventual large snowfalls, particularly to the Peak District and more widely.
Yeah.
So that may be where we go next week. You know, we're at the beginning of that same pattern evolution. You would say we're kind of at the beginning of that, and it could yet be at some point middle of next week we drift into that sort of cold air mass east-northeasterly conveyor belt, and somewhere gets a fair lengthy snowfall. But wait and see.
And I was thinking 2017 as well, 8th of December, was it 9th of December 2017, similar one where we got a northerly, and then an area of low pressure drifted across southern England, and that gave sort of Wales, the Midlands, East Anglia. I think we were sort of 15 centimetres of snow on that day.
That was a little bit of a different
feel,
I remember.
It wasn't.
That was more. Yeah, go on.
So I was just going to say, it wasn't this depth. Well, not depth of cold. It wasn't brought about purely by colder air to the north getting in. It was more a kind of a few day event. It was 3 or 4 days, I think, and then the milder air returned. I think.
Simon here. I'm just going to steal a couple of moments of your time to tell you about Weatherweb Premium. So Weatherweb Premium is a subscription service for those who need to know more. So farmers, agronomists, energy traders, and just about anybody who needs to make the weather work for their business or for their hobby. You can find out more at weatherweb.net, but you'll get daily videos, you'll get 2-week planning videos, you'll get our discussions about the weather that's coming up and the long-term trends as well that we're expecting through the coming seasons, as well as full access to all of our unique charts. To get a free 3-day trial, go to weatherweb.net now. See you there. On with the video.
I think after that.
Yeah, that was one of those sort of just areas of low pressure that is the typical rain to snow boundary. That was very sort of a fine threshold somewhere across the Midlands, wasn't it? And we got a few flakes from it on the very northern edge, and you got much more, of course.
Yeah.
I think since 2010, the main thing is that when there has been cold air which has allowed snow, it's been very much a single event, a flash in the pan, if you like. 3-4 days at most, and I think was that one at the end of February 2018 as well. It came in from the northeast. This is the first time there is a considerable pool of cold air and considerable blocking going right back to what's coming off the United States, the eastern seaboard. It's a very block system all the way through. What I have found unusual this time that's happening at the moment is the almost in situ considerable deepening of Atlantic lows southwest of the Azores. It's a long way south, in quite a thermal gradient, and then eventually into next week these things start to move eastwards, very much due to something, again, complex that's coming out of the United States. And as that happens, an upper flow gives them all a kick. But it is very complicated, and just how it what comes off the United States will give the downstream systems a kick is what's troubling all the models, and they just cannot get hold of. But it does seem that there will, for a few days, be a upper jet, if you like, 45 degrees north running into 45, 50 north running into Europe, and there will be lows coming along with it. So it's as you say, it's very much where the northern edge of that snow is going to be. Either Tuesday or Wednesday. I notice I think EC and the Met Office seem to go for Tuesday. GFS is a bit more wobbly. I think GFS has been a little bit more wobbly than the others, but it's complex, and it's still complex, and I think our weather is about what's way back, maybe over the central, maybe over the western United States at the moment. We've got to look a long way away for the downstream implications this time next week, if you like. Yeah, it's how that feeds in, isn't it? What are you gone with today, Lexi? What was your forecast for next week today? What did you decide on? She dared say
for a week today.
Yeah.
Today, Wednesday. You're talking about for like the week ahead and stuff like that.
Yeah. What did you
saying just that, actually turning unsettled potentially. With the lower pressure moving in. I didn't really give a lot of detail, but I said potentially like England, Wales, southern parts of Ireland seeing rain with some snow on the northern edge, like preceding the edge of it. I mean, I didn't want to give too much detail with it all, but I did on the 2-week planner, I kind of with it all, I kind of said that there's potential for lower pressure to move in. I mean, that's been showing on the EC longer run of what we've been looking at for the 6-week outlook, that lower pressure through that sort of second week of December for the last week or two has been looking like lower pressure was going to move in, and obviously we've got the cold air at the moment, so I've just been using the word it could be quite interesting next week. But yeah, as you're all saying, it's a tricky one. We've got to see how the lower pressure comes in, because it's been flipping a little bit with the models. So, but it does look like a slightly different week to this week in terms of having more precip potentially coming about, more widespread. That's kind of the drift I've been giving.
I did notice interestingly yesterday, the 12Z ECMWF put the low pressure through the UK and brought milder air across much of England, Wales and Ireland. And for example, put the -5 across southern parts of Scotland. So it was just that one run. But I think what's interesting about that is that when you look at the accuracy stats, the midday run of the ECMWF outperforms by quite a margin the midnight run of the ECMWF for the past couple of months. So now I'm not saying that that's the way this is going to go, but it was just interesting. It threw that in. The story was still the same, but the milder air was much further north. It's the only time I've seen it do it. But, normally you'd chuck that out the window and say, well, there's no credence there. But just, I thought it was interesting looking at the stats that midday is more accurate than the midnight, particularly on the 500 millibar heights. So that was quite interesting.
That's interesting, because it's not something I'd picked up. If we went back a week, 4, 5, 6, 7 days, I think there were more outcomes from all the models that suggested that the southwesterly would at least have a go at coming in. But I think looking at the ensembles, generally, it's now looking as if that is unlikely. I suspect, I did see the midday run of EC yesterday, and I think it was very much an outlier. Coming back to the other subject about next week being higher precipitation, again, if we went back 4, 5, 6, 7 days, we would have been talking about late this week, the weekend, and early next week, more precipitation. The lows were generally deeper, more wind, precipitation coming round and getting further inland, whereas now it looks like very flabby lows and actually almost windless in a number of areas until well into
into next week.
Mm.
The only other thing compared to, say, 2010, when it was almost certain that, except on some coastal extremities, it was going to be snow, I think this time it is less certain.
Mm.
Although it is cold, the freezing levels, if you like, over the surrounding sea, the northern North Sea, the sea off Scotland, the freezing level is up at 500, 600, 700 meters day in day, 5 or 6, rather than 2 or 3, which does make it more difficult to say, will it be rain, will it be snow, or even as it comes inland, to what extent it will turn to snow. So, yeah, not an easy one as we go into next week. I suspect some low-lying areas will see more rain than snow, albeit that if the low is as deep as, I think it's the Met Office I was looking at next Tuesday, a really deep low pulling cold, dry air in cold conveyor belt, that will produce evaporative cooling, and that will in turn mean a fairly extensive area of snow come Tuesday, I think it was. But it's not clear cut that in the cities it will be snow.
Yeah, it's your classic forecaster's nightmare, isn't it? Really.
Yeah.
Because you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, and you will get it right in some areas, and it will be horrendously wrong in others. There are going to be people who are very disappointed, and others who are very happy.
That low that affects us next week is really quite deep out in the Atlantic, though, isn't it? It's got quite an umph to it. It's just when it gets closer to us, by the time we get to sort of Monday into Tuesday, the winds, you look like, oh, it's going to be strengthened. Yeah, the winds look quite hefty, but then it just sort of dies away quite quickly and becomes just flopsy.
And the GFS does seem to lose the story quite quickly, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
GFS doesn't seem to have much of a handle on it. It seems that he's coming to the fore with the story overall.
I'm not surprised from GFS point of view, because that's the one that, if anything, would want to try and find a westerly if it could try.
Yeah, it would.
So it would always lean that way. So I think that if that's coming up with the odd slightly different answer, to treat it with a little bit of a pinch of salt.
I was using the GFS this morning for the 2-week planner, and I kept sort of saying, the EC has a slightly different outcome, so confidence is low,
It doesn't seem to know what to do, does it, GFS? Well, the ensemble certainly after next Friday, there's your westerly, like Garry says, westerly back in milder conditions.
Whereas the EC falls back into like this sort of on and off northerly. Once the sort of area of low pressure moves out the way, you get something else coming down from the north, and
the EC ensembles, though, as for GFS, are flipping toward westerly in the second week. They've gone quite a long way in this last 24, 36 hours. And I just looked at the midnight EC, and that's gone further. So at some stage, weekend after next, 10 days time-ish, it's now looking more likely than not, I would say, that there will be a change. Whereas 48 hours ago, that change was looking, I would have said, very speculative, and you could have almost seen it remaining very blocked through until Christmas. I think there has been a jump there.
Yeah, a change.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we're thinking Christmas then? Let's throw that out there. What we're thinking Christmas? I'm going to go with Geoff. I'm going to say, actually, I think it's probably milder by then.
I think a messy transition period where it's still a bit of a battleground going on, where even if it's suddenly become milder for some, you haven't quite got rid of the prospects of there being some snowfall for others. I think the extent of the block that's there right now would kind of sort of keep itself within the pattern recognition on and off for a good number of weeks. So it's just going to be where it falls as relating to the time through the Christmas period, as to whether we're just on the edge of the milder air for a while or going back to being colder. And you even think of the 2010 evolution of the pattern. Come the 7th, 8th of December, that went suddenly much milder for a sort of a week or so. But by Christmas, the colder air had shifted back in. And I remember we had a -10 again around the Christmas period of an air temperature. So although the snow, or the biggest of the snow, had gone and never came back, the cold air did come back in again. So yeah, messy transition. That would be where I'd go with it.
Okay. Go on then, Alexi.
Oh, I don't know. I'm looking at the longer outlook from the ECMWF that we got yesterday for it. And that kind of has slightly more influence, some higher pressure over Greenland, sort of pushing down towards the Atlantic, a little bit of a lower pressure over us, but nothing like the previous weeks, like we're about to supposedly go into. So it kind of pulls back, and then the idea is for higher pressure then to build in towards New Year, supposedly. So yeah, maybe actually I would say I'd probably go with what Gary's saying a little bit more. There could be this transitional bit in between where that could be that run up to Christmas Day. It's a difficult one to call though, isn't it?
I feel that we're going to continue to see lows that take a southerly track.
Yeah.
It depends how far south. I think we're going to be in a position where getting low pressure back up towards Iceland is not going to be as common. It might happen briefly, but more often for the next sort of 6 to 8 weeks, maybe, that low pressure systems are taking a track near or south of us, and at times when they just get in and swirl around, and we get into a sort of southeasterly that has its origins from the Mediterranean, which might become a bit milder, but all swirling into what is cold air never too far away, and that might just keep going back and forth. So it's that back and forth midwinter spell rather than necessarily one that sets in for the cold fully, but within that, spells of a week or more where it does go cold.
So, and I'm just wondering, and this is pure sort of anecdotal stuff, is that the longer we're staying cold, is that going to mean that the longer it takes to get rid of that cold, dense air? Which is what I think both you are saying, Alexi and Garry, that actually sort of the mild air kind of nibbles away at the cold. It goes away for a time, but the cold keeps coming back because that tends to be stronger than the milder air. But eventually that milder air breaks through. The question is when that actually comes through. I mean, that's the way I'm reading it at the moment, is that there will be eventually that break in the milder air, which I think is what Geoff was saying is going to be sort of by Christmas. And I kind of lean into that idea that it's by Christmas. But this kind of chipping away of a block of cold air seems to be the theme that we're all going with, is that the cold air is in, but then it's quite difficult to shove out of the way.